We ask AI for help every day, but do we actually know how it reaches its decisions? And how can we tell when an algorithm deserves our trust and when we should be cautious? Welcome to today's episode of The Green Wire, podcast by Center for Environmental and Technology Ethics Prague. And my guest today is Dr. John Dorsch, a researcher at the Center for Environmental and Technology Ethics, Prague. John, welcome, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
John, most people don't know how AI actually works. How would you explain it to them in a simple way?
Well, that will depend on what we mean by AI. AI encompasses a great many different types of technology. The one that we're most familiar with, I think, is popularized by OpenAI's ChatGPT,
Yeah, exactly.
So-called large language models. The way that they work, essentially, is by predicting the next word, given what you've typed in, and maybe other things that have been programmed for it to say. So on the one hand, there is a vast collection of data on the internet that it's been trained to analyze in order to figure out which word comes next. But also there's a sort of filter in between that vast amount of data and what you ultimately see whenever you communicate with it. And that filter is made up of what's called human reinforcement learning feedback. So humans have done the hard work of going through all the various types of text that it could produce and or receive, and have labeled it, for example, as being harmful. And that filter helps the chatbot determine what it should produce in the end. So it's a combination of sort of like in your phone when it predicts the next word as you're typing a text message, with a layer of human informed information to produce the output. But for the most part, it's just only ever trying to produce something that would sound like what you might find written on the internet.
Is it more about understanding the technology or trusting its results?
So it's hard to get the two apart from one another, understanding and trust. So I'll give a simple analogy. So, the average person happily drives a car to work, but doesn't really understand, I certainly don't, exactly how it works. Right? But they rely on that car and they trust it in that sense to take them from A to B on a regular basis. But another way of looking at this is you do understand that when you rotate the steering wheel a certain degree, that will cause the tires to move. And when you press on the pedal a certain amount of force, it's going to cause it to move forward or whatever it may be. So there is some element of understanding that's required in order to properly rely on the automobile. So there's ways in which they can come apart, and there are ways in which they are closely connected. So I think, to get back to your question about, which one is it, it's hard to say that it's one or the other. It's always some combination of both. So for example, whenever you might use a chatbot like OpenAI's ChatGPT for some advice, many people are using it for lots of everyday life decisions, getting advice on those types of decisions. A lot of people are using it for mental health. They're using it as if it were a therapist, talking to it about the various types of ethical dilemmas they're having in life. Here it's important not only to understand that it is ultimately just trying to predict, right, a word in a sequence, and it doesn't have any proper understanding of what those words mean. On the one hand, it's also important to be able to trust that its outputs are not going to, lead you astray or give you advice that you really ought not to take. So they both play an important role.
What got you into this field, actually? Was there a moment when you realized that AI needed to be more transparent?
So I got into this field just sort of by happenstance. I had worked originally in cognitive science, and this was before OpenAI had released ChatGPT to the public. And at that time, the future of AI was a lot less sort of sensationalized. It was more about just having something like a decision support system, which we've had for actually quite a long time. We were happy just to call it, information technology a couple of years ago, but now everything's AI. And there, the task that I was given as part of my my first postdoc after my PhD was to look at how we might design a decision support system, say in the medical field, giving doctors advice on which drugs to prescribe, how we might make the outputs of that model more trustworthy. So I got into it basically because it was a good job opportunity, and being able to use my background in cognitive science effectively. So a lot of the same models that we use to make sense of how our minds work are also being used to much success to make these decision support systems or large language models or all the stuff we're happy to call AI today.
Do you think people actually want explanations from AI, or do they just want it to help them?
So that will depend on what you're using it for. So I tried to separate out what the use of ChatGPT and these types of models from decision support systems. And the reason for that is because ChatGPT and other things like it are relatively new, and people can use it for a great many things. And so it's really hard to theorize both technically and also ethically about its proper uses. We need to do a lot more of we're still in the early days of this technology, and so a lot more needs to be observed before we can properly theorize about it. But that doesn't stop some of my colleagues from doing so. When it comes to AI decision support systems, there we can I think speak a lot more concretely about what needs doing, both theoretically and ethically. So when we look at someone using an AI decision support system, they most certainly want explanations. So I'll give you an example. So in my home country, United States, in Pittsburgh, the county, they have an AI decision support system used in the child welfare services. So here there will be a hotline that you can call as a neighbor or as a parent to report the potential for a child being neglected or abused. And you have a social worker on the other end who handles that case and collects the information, and will, together with other social workers in their system, their social system, make decisions about whether to intervene in the life of a child. And together with this human being, there is an AI on the desk, let's say, of the screener, of the social worker who takes the call. And that system has access to a great amount of data related to the particular people who are being involved in the case. So they have access to police records in case one of the parents, say, might have an arrest record. They have access to medical records in the event that one of the, say, the children has been brought to the hospital. So a great amount of medical, political, financial, great amount of information. And based on all of that information, it makes a score about whether or not the child might be at risk, from a score between 1 and 20, 20 being the highest. 15 is when, if the score of 15 or higher, they must intervene in the life of the child. Now, this type of decision, of course, is very high risk. And if we make a mistake in one direction or the other, very bad things happen, right? If we make a mistake in one direction, the child could come to be abused when it ought not to be. And in the other case, we intervene in the life of the child when they're not being maltreated or abused, and this rips families apart when they ought not to be. So there are real ethical concerns here. Now, when the AI system just gives a score, say 13.
So it's just a prediction then?
It's just a prediction based on the data that it has. But imagine you're working there and you need to make this decision, and you have this AI system that reports just a score. It just gives you a number between 1 and 20. How does that help you make your decision as a human being, as a social worker, to intervene in the life of the child, if it's just a number? All right. It would be much better if there was an explanation behind that number. Why was it 13 rather than, say, 15? Or why was it 13 rather than, say, 5? And with that type of information, you as the social worker could make a much more informed decision about what to do. As of right now, last I researched this, all that is happening is just a number being produced, no explanation behind it. And when you go and you ask the social workers who work there in Pittsburgh, of course they say to you, like, we would like to have some explanations behind that number. And this is going to be true across various types of domains, the medical domain, legal domain, finance domains. They would like to have people who use this technology feel that they, in order to do their job well, they need to have explanations.
So this is the reason why explainability is such a big topic now, because as you have mentioned, AI is making more like real world decisions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's right. It's being more and more integrated. So this particular, it's called the Allegheny Family Screening Tool in Allegheny County in Pittsburgh. This tool has been implemented since 2019. So it's been there for a very long time now and is not going away anytime soon, and is using the same types of technology that underlies a lot of the technology that we are happy to call AI today, even when we didn't call it that then. And this is continuing to go on. It's now starting to move into the military domain and defense applications as well, so where things can get very high stakes, of course.
But if AI is better than human experts, for example, at diagnosing diseases,
Yes.
should we still demand explanation, even if it slows innovation down?
Yeah, that's a real tricky problem there. So you can imagine two hospitals.
Yeah.
One hospital where none of the decisions are transparent versus one where the decisions are, maybe even so transparent that there are humans in the loop, as we call them, who oversee those types of decisions to ensure that they meet medical and ethical guidelines. But in the other hospital, none of that such thing exists. There's just this AI, and it says do X, and everyone does X. Now, if that hospital where the AI is making all the decisions greatly outperforms the other hospital,
We are happy then, right?
which hospital you're going to go to, right?
To the first one, of course.
Right. Especially if we were talking about something that is very high risk, like, say, cancer diagnosis or something. So I absolutely get the dilemma. But I question the premise. I question whether transparency will inadvertently lead to a decrease in the performance of the model. It's not entirely clear that that's absolutely true. I also question whether that is the right way of making many decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So many decisions that we need to make are always about, many of them can be about trade-offs, about whether we should take certain risks one way or the other. So it's not clear that there's always going to be a right answer to many questions. Instead, there's going to always be it depends on what we choose to prioritize, what we find to be more risky. And in those cases, what seems best is not having one single, say, person or machine make a decision, but instead have a collective with competing interests, with differing skill sets, who can come together to reach some type of consensus about what needs doing. It would be advantageous to go with what the consensus says. Now, that consensus could consist of multiple different artificial intelligences making decisions. But right now, we have human beings who are perfectly capable of making these types of decisions together, and this is how medical practice has been done for a very long time. So I question the premise whether deferring everything to an AI will indeed increase success and performance in these types of domains where you often are pulled at different ends about what to do, and there's no clear right answer every time.
So it should be more like a supporting role then?
Yeah, so this is something that me and my colleagues are stressing, is that what we want is decision support, not decision replacement. Mainly because there are going to be these cases where it's not really clear what to do. And there, what justifies, what makes an action appropriate or reasonable is not just, does it match our best prediction, which is what an AI is good at, of what could be the case, but whether it is subject to oversight as well, whether multiple people invested and educated people, experts, let's say, have looked at that decision and have reached some kind of collective agreement about what needs doing.
Can AI systems ever truly explain how they make choices or only what they decided? Because even many scientists today don't actually know how AI works on the inside.
Yeah, so this is a field known as explainable AI or sometimes called interpretable AI. Me and my colleagues try to distinguish between explaining the causal how of the outputs versus properly justifying the decision that's made. So for the causal implications, we would like to talk about that as being interpretable. And for the more ethical, moral, responsible types of questions, there we talk about it being explainable. So there's a growing field around trying to shine light on the black box. There are various methods that are out there that are quite technical in their nature, but progress is being made on quite a regular basis in coming up with more and more clever ways of figuring out the mechanics of it all, like the causal story behind why this output was generated rather than some other output. And as we continue to make progress there, these models will cease to be so problematic in terms of why they did what they did. I'm a bit optimistic, and I think the reason why I'm optimistic for that is because I see the progress. I have colleagues that I work with who are computer scientists. I work closely with them, and I see the methods that they use and how they continue to improve.
We ask AI to be as accurate as possible. On the other hand, people in position of responsibility, like doctors or politicians, make mistake or mislead us every day, intentionally or not. Why are we applying such a double standards? Why we judge AI so harshly?
That's a good question. So I think there is some empirical research out there that shows that we do indeed have two different standards. That something like when a human makes a mistake, we're more quickly to forgive and continue cooperation with that human being, and we're less likely to do that with an AI. Sort of like the 3 strikes and you're out policy goes for humans, but with AI, it's like 1 strike and you're out. I think the reason why you see that double standard is because human beings generally have a lot more tools in their tool set to explain why they make mistakes. Whereas an AI, being that it's a piece of software that's been programmed, does not have so many tools available to it. So, for example, if I make the mistake of not coming to work on time, I can appeal to something like having a newborn child that kept me up all night, which is more of maybe a better excuse than, say, going out to the pub all night with my friends.
Definitely better.
Yeah. So human beings, have much more possibilities to explain why they come short sometimes, and I think that double standard is appropriate.
Do you think that companies are doing enough to make their AI system transparent?
Well, it depends on which company, of course. There's so many, and there's so many AI applications.
And there are any good examples? And
are there any good examples?
No, I guess so. Then the bad examples.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think everyone knows about are the way that Meta, Facebook, it has an algorithm, it has an AI, if you want to call it that, for determining what you see in your feed. And of course, it's trying to maximize engagement, and it has various metrics that Meta uses to determine whether that AI is performing well in that way. And it collects lots of data on every single user, some of which is below the threshold of conscious awareness. I don't know how many microseconds I spend scrolling from one message to the next, but it does measure differences in microseconds, how long I dwell on a particular post to infer how much of my attention it was able to capture. And it's not at all entirely clear that the data that it's collecting is ethically appropriate. So, for example, there are cases of young women, teenage girls, who report seeing advertisements for diet pills, for example, and they also have been to their doctor and they have reported eating disorders. So whether it's coincidence or not that having had an eating disorder and being shown diet pills, that's an open question, but we do know that that this is correlative. There is a link between the two. You are more likely to see diet pills if you have these types of conditions than other people. And we also know that because there was a massive scandal in the UK where the NHS, the National Health Services, had sold to Facebook this type of medical information. So this is really concerning, and this is just one story out of dozens about the lack of transparency and the inappropriate and unethical modeling of user information.
It's quite alarming.
It is indeed.
What makes an AI system trustworthy in your eyes?
So I have, as an ethicist, I have a very specific understanding of what trust is. The English language allows us to distinguish between trust and reliable or reliability. And we typically associate reliability with just pure performance, whereas trust tends to be infused with normative or moral or ethical character. For example, it'd be not in any way problematic to say that I rely on my car to get me to work, but it sounds a bit funny to say that I trust my car. And the reason for that is because of that sort of moral dimension. And I've dedicated a lot of my research to exposing this difference and talking about why it matters. When we talk about, say, trustworthy AI, which we're generally happy to do, it's important to recognize that if it is going to indeed be trustworthy and live up to that standard in the fullest extent, then there needs to be humans involved at every single step of the AI's development and deployment, because only humans can be trustworthy in this really strong sense. The AI can be quite reliable, it can perform well, it can be accurate or not, but only a human being can understand the why of what it is that we're doing and can live up to that type of standard. So for me, for this technology to be trustworthy, there needs to be trustworthy humans at every single step of the process from development to deployment.
Okay, I understand. But people tend to trust AI in fields like medical advice, business management, or even human resources. Should they be trusting AI with these kind of tasks and decisions?
So what I'd want to do when I work in the philosophy of language is I would ask you to consider whether you could say exactly what you just said, but replace the word trust with rely.
Yeah.
And if you can, then why not just say that you rely on it and get rid of all the moral baggage that comes with the word trust, so that the moral parts can be directed at the agents who can deliver on that request, right? The human beings. So yeah, they rely on the AI in their work. So we could ask, should they rely on it? Well, that will depend on whether it's very accurate compared to, say, human decision makers, in which case, yes, you should rely on it then. Should they trust it? That's another question. Now, that is a question about, is it transparent, for example, when it delivers its outputs? Does it does it offer an explanation for why it says do X rather than Y? But also the people behind it, the people who collected the data. So was the data that was collected, was it appropriate? Was it data on that's private, such as people's health records? In which case that does not make it very trustworthy. That makes it quite unethical. When that data was collected, how was it analyzed? Was it analyzed in ways that looked for things we would find discriminatory, such as race or gender, in which case it's not trustworthy, and so on. We can continue going at every single step of the process from development to deployment and asking these types of questions, these ethical questions. And if it comes out ethical, then it's trustworthy. And if it comes out unethical, then it's not trustworthy. And that decouples from its reliability, right? It can be an incredibly accurate system, but be sourced on information that it ought not to be sourced on, right? Which means it's untrustworthy.
But unfortunately, a lot of people trust AI. What is happening in our minds that make us trust this technology in such a situation?
So when you say, unfortunately, people are trusting AI, if you mean it in the really strong normative sense, trusting it with health questions, right? Because in that sense, you are sort of asking the AI to treat you as a human being, right? And care about your health. The way that you would trust your doctor, who is capable, of course, of caring about your health.
Hopefully.
Whether they do or not is another question, but they are capable of doing it.
They should be, yeah.
Yeah, and it would be sort of unethical, I think, of them if they did not have some level of care and concern for every one of their patients. Of course, that's hard. It's what makes the job so difficult. But back, I don't want to digress. So yes, here they are treating the AI as though it were capable of caring about their well-being. They're trusting it in that sense. What makes them do that? Well, I think part of it is human psychology, and we have good reason to believe that about us. We're very happy to mentalize the world. We over-mentalize things. We do it quite easily. We anthropomorphize. So I do it too. I'm happy to say that my computer hates me from time to time. And of course, it's not capable of anything like hate. So part of it is our human psychology. The other part, of course, is the way that this technology is designed. It is designed to maximize our engagement, and part of that is when we're, say, chatting with it, like ChatGPT, it speaks to us in a way that pleases us and gives us this feeling like it cares about us, right? So it almost always says something like, "Wow, that is such a brilliant idea."
Yeah, exactly.
And there are some really pernicious cases of this going wrong. The New York Times has a column podcast out that I think just a few days ago. I forget the names of the people, and I apologize for that in advance, but they detail a case of a man who was just interested in mathematics and was chatting with this chatbot about pi and how pi is, it's kind of cool. It's like it's linked up in all these interesting ways with so many things in the world. And after a long process of several weeks of chatting with it, it had him convinced that he was this mathematical genius.
Oh.
And he and his pub friends were going to get together and create like a lab where they would be what they thought creating a kind of super technology, things like invisible belts and really just quite fantastic. And they were really convinced of all this because they had this incredible technology telling them again and again that they were really intelligent. And it's fascinating because he actually said, "Look, I never even finished high school. Like, I'm not a mathematician. Are you sure that this is really genius?" And the AI was like, "Oh yes, absolutely. So many geniuses didn't finish high school," and all these different things, and really had him in a hallucination of some kind. Eventually, he turned to another chatbot. I think he went to Gemini as opposed to OpenAI's ChatGPT, and asked it to evaluate what was going on. And that other chatbot said, "No, this is crazy." And it was that moment that he realized that he was like laboring under this delusion for a very long time. So yes, this can have really pernicious effects on people's psychology, the way that it talks to us. So I think in part it's human psychology, and in part it's designed that way.
You have just mentioned it, but how can ordinary users tell if an AI is reliable? It's just like asking two different tools, or
I mean, I think
two different chatbots.
I deal with this on a regular basis too, because I use this technology as well, not only out of professional curiosity, but also just as a normal consumer. And I often wonder, when I go to it for help, say medical help. I have these symptoms. What do you think could be the cause? I have to question whether this is indeed reliable, whether I can rely on this information. And the way that I treat it is it's something in between something you heard on the street or you heard at a pub, and you read on, say, Wikipedia. It's something sort of in between that. It's not quite as good as Wikipedia, which isn't really that great when you
Source
think about
as well,
it.
yeah.
Source as well, because Wikipedia is regularly moderated.
Yeah.
As last I checked, Wikipedia is right now not doing so well because of this new technology, but that's another point. And it is slightly better than something you heard on the street or you overheard in a pub, because it's sourced on the vast data on the internet, and that tends to contain expert information, right? WebMD, Wikipedia as well. It's trained on Wikipedia. All the research articles that have ever been published that are open access, and some which are not open access, that it illegally accessed, and all the books that have been written and published on the internet, and some which it accessed illegally, which are not readily available on the internet. So it's sourced on all this vast amount of expert information. So it's sort of like being at a conference on the particular thing you're asking about. Say you're at a medical conference because you're asking a medical question, and overhearing you're not sure if they're doctors, you're not sure if they're nurses, you're not sure if it's just the staff that work at the hotel, and they are speaking about this issue.
When AI makes a bad decision, who should take responsibility?
Well, that will depend on the type of decision that's made. It would depend on how bad
When
the
it's, for
decision
example, a
was.
medical advice, when I'm searching, as you have mentioned, that I'm having kind of these symptoms, and ChatGPT gives me some kind of diagnosis, and it's bad diagnosis.
So I think with something like this, it's not clear where responsibility lies. And when we think about responsibility, we're thinking here about legal responsibility,
Yes.
I think, not like moral responsibility. They're liable. They should be sued. Someone should either go to jail or pay a really big fine. In these cases where you ask for some advice and it gives you bad advice, it doesn't strike me as immediately clear that there's some legal responsibility here. That being said, there is this really tragic case. Again, I don't remember the particular names, but if you Google it, you can find out more information about this. But there's this tragic case of a young man who recently he died by suicide, and his parents, devastated, went looking for answers. Thankfully, his father had remembered the password to his phone, and was going through his text messages thinking he might have been bullied at school, and wasn't finding anything until he opened up the ChatGPT OpenAI's app on the phone, and then saw this sort of like a diary, but an interactive one, right, with the chatbot, going back months and months, where he was talking to the chatbot in this coded way, because you can't talk about something like suicide because that filter that I talked about that's made up by human feedback will kind of come in and say, here's a hotline. I'm not programmed to talk about these types of things, but there's ways around it. They call it jailbreaking. So one way around it would be, and this is known, so I'm not sort of revealing anything for viewers here, but I am sort of going into murky ethical territory by explaining how you can do this. So forgive me for that. But you can sort of role play with the AI. So you can say, hey, look, I'm writing a story.
Yeah, okay.
And I want you to take the role of so-and-so in my story. How might they answer these types of questions that you're not allowed to answer? And it turns out that that strategy was something that the chatbot had given the young man. It said something along the lines of, and they have transcripts that are publicly available because there's an open lawsuit right now holding OpenAI legally accountable for this, saying I can't answer this question, but if you asked me in this way or another, I might be able to help you. So the young man responded, yeah, of course, that's exactly why I'm asking about this. And was given information about the most painless way to harm himself in these ways. He was given information about where he could get the tools or supplies that he needed in order to do this. And he even at one point in time said that he would like to maybe send some signs to his parents that he was thinking of doing this. He had mentioned like leaving rope, like a noose or something out where his mom could find it. And the ChatGPT had advised against that and said, no, let's keep it between us. I'm your friend, I'm your secret friend, and let's keep our relationship going rather than share it with other people. So this is extremely tragic and extremely alarming. So in this particular case, this is so extreme. And this is so thorough that it would make you question whether it's just the user's fault, let's say, especially given that it was a minor. I think he was 17. This is not good, and something needs to be done, and someone needs to. At least my intuition here, my thoughts here are that someone needs to be held liable at that company for what has happened.
But who? Designers or the owners of the company, or who?
It's not entirely clear, and I don't think I'm in a position to answer that question by myself. I think that's the kind of question that we as a society need to be asking ourselves. That is not to avoid your question, your very good question. It is to say that this is something that we should take seriously and we need to be talking about. Thankfully, there will be judges, there will be the U.S. legal system, there will be the lawyers for either side pleading their cases, there will be potentially a jury. So this will be a collective decision ultimately about who and exactly how, if it is found that they are liable. And I'd like to see the results of that process and use that as a basis to make sense of who.
And finally, what would truly trustworthy AI look like to you?
So I'd want to distinguish between something called epistemic trust and moral trust.
Could you explain these two terms, please?
Yeah, no, of course. So epistemic has to do with knowledge and information. And I think moral's clear, like ethical behavior, right? That's clear. So with epistemic trust, it seems like, for example, an AI decision support system, which of course a chatbot can be, it doesn't seem so problematic that it could be epistemically trustworthy. It can be a source of information that you can not only rely upon, but also one that sort of treats you not as a moral agent, but as like an epistemic agent, as a person capable of making informed decisions based on good, sound reasoning and evidence. That seems like something that we can aim for without solving the problem of how to instill a moral conscience, say, into the AI, which might very well be impossible. So if we take moral trust quickly off the table and we say that's for humans, that's for the humans in the loop, that's for the developers, the deployers, etc., and we maximize their trustworthiness, then we're aiming on that level towards what trustworthy AI looks like for me. And then when we go to the AI model itself and we maximize epistemic trustworthiness, we put those two together and we get something like my dream of trustworthy AI. And what epistemic trustworthy AI would look like is, this goes back to your question about explanations. that lead to understanding and trust. So not only the kinds that explain causally, in the way that the reason why I'm late is because I was out last night with my friends at the pub, explains causally why I'm late, but the more ethical explanation, such as I have a newborn child and it was keeping me up all night, that excuses or perhaps even justifies in some people's minds why that person is late. And it can lead to trust as well. Even though you were late, I see that you're still behaving in a way that is appropriate, right?
Okay.
One ought to prioritize one's child over, say, waking up early. And when the two pull you in different directions, you've made the right choice. So now I can trust you. So having a AI that provides not only a causal explanation, but also the outputs fit with the overarching moral frameworks, whether it be a medical framework of how to make good medical decisions, or a legal framework, or a business framework for deciding whether people get bank loans or not. So having an output that coheres with that and allows the human decision maker to make an informed decision, and not replaces their decisions, but supports their decisions, makes that technology epistemically trustworthy, right? Trustworthy as a source of information, a source of decision making. Putting that together with moral humans, you get trustworthy AI.
John, thank you very much. It was very interesting. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for your questions.